I came home from Ramstein expecting quiet. What I found instead was a white sign staked into the dirt at the end of my grandfather's long gravel drive. Estate auction. Black letters bold and final. My duffel was still biting into my shoulder. The smell of jet fuel hadn't even left my clothes yet. I stood there staring at that sign while my phone vibrated in my pocket, a missed call from my father. When I finally dialed the auction company listed below the date, the woman on the line went silent. Then she said carefully, like she was stepping around broken glass, "Ma'am, everything was sold last month." The drive from the airport should have taken 90 minutes. It took me almost 3 hours because I kept pulling over my hands, shaking on the wheel, my mind refusing to line up with what my eyes had seen. I'd left Germany on a gray morning with rain crawling down the terminal windows, thinking about my grandfather's farm the way you think about a lighthouse steady waiting unchanged. He'd raised 3 kids there. He'd buried my grandmother under the oak by the fence. He'd taught me how to mend wire and read weather off the horizon. That land was the one constant in a family that otherwise drifted. When I turned onto County Road 18, the fields looked wrong. Not empty, just unfamiliar. The old red tractor wasn't parked near the barn. The gate was closed when it was usually open. And there at the end of the drive was the sign. I parked and got out, gravel crunching under my boots. The wind moved through the corn stubble like it was whispering to me, and for a moment I thought maybe I was still jet-lagged, still not fully back. My father was waiting by the house with my brother and sister. They were already inside my grandfather's place, doors open, boxes stacked. My brother Mark leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed like he owned the view. My sister Elaine had her hair pulled back tight, her voice sharp and organized as she directed someone I didn't recognize to carry something out to a truck. "Hey," my father said like I'd just come home from the grocery store. I asked the question that felt obvious. "What is this?" He glanced at the sign, then back at me. "Estate sale," he said. "It's time." Time for what? For everyone to move on. That was when Elaine stepped closer, eyes flicking to my duffel. "We already took what we needed," she said. "You can take whatever's left." The words landed wrong. Whatever's left. Like my grandfather's life was a clearance rack. I didn't argue, not yet. I walked into the house. The air smelled like dust and lemon cleaner. Furniture was missing. The hutch where my grandmother kept her china was gone. The den looked stripped, no hunting rifles on the wall, no quilt folded over the back of the couch. My chest tightened as I moved room to room, inventorying absence. I found the kitchen table scarred where someone had dragged something heavy across it. The drawer where Grandpa kept his ledgers was empty. So was the cabinet with the mason jars full of nails and bolts he'd collected for decades. These weren't random losses. These were choices. Who decided to do this now? I asked, my voice steady, because that's what training does. It teaches you how to keep your tone even when everything inside you is loud. My father sighed. "You weren't here." I looked at him. "I called every Sunday." He waved a hand. "That's not the same." Mark snorted. "You live halfway around the world. What did you expect?" I expected a phone call. I expected a conversation. I expected not to come home to a sign in the dirt announcing the end of the place that raised me. "Who's running the auction?" I asked. Elaine answered quickly, too quickly. "A local company. They're reputable." "What's their name?" She gave it. I pulled out my phone and stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The wind was colder than I remembered. I dialed. A woman answered, cheerful at first. I gave my name. I asked about the auction date. I asked what lots were available. There was a pause. I could hear papers shifting, keys tapping. Then her voice changed. "Ma'am," she said, "the estate has already been liquidated." I leaned against the post, the porch rail digging into my spine. Liquidated. Yes, the assets were sold privately. Settlement closed weeks ago. I swallowed. "Then why is your sign on the property?" Another pause. "That shouldn't be there." "Who authorized the sale?" She hesitated. "I can't discuss specifics without—" "I'm the granddaughter," I said, "and nothing about this makes sense." She lowered her voice. "I'd suggest you speak with the executor." I ended the call and stood there, the house humming behind me with voices and footsteps that didn't belong. When I turned back, my father's face told me he already knew what I was going to say. They told me everything was sold, I said. Mark scoffed, So the auction is a lie. Elaine's mouth tightened. Don't be dramatic. Then explain it, I said. Explain why they sold everything before I even landed. My father rubbed his forehead. It was easier this way. Easier for who? He didn't answer. I walked down the steps and into the yard past the barn where the doors were locked. I ran my hand along the fence post my grandfather had replaced the summer I turned 16. The wood was rough and familiar, grounding me. This place wasn't just property. It was memory. It was work. It was promise. Behind me, my father called out, "You can take what's left." I turned slowly. What's left of what? He looked away. That was the moment I understood something fundamental had shifted. They weren't waiting for my opinion. They'd already moved on. They'd already divided, already justified. And they were counting on me to accept scraps because I wore a uniform and lived far away and had learned over years how to endure loss quietly. I picked up my duffel and set it by the truck. "I'm going to town," I said. Elaine crossed her arms. "Why?" "Because I replied someone's lying, and I'm done guessing who." I drove back down the long gravel drive, the auction sign rattling in the rearview mirror as I passed. My phone buzzed with a text from Elaine, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I didn't answer. By the time I reached the main road, my hands were steady, not because I was calm, because something else had taken over. The same thing that kicks in when plans go sideways and you have to adapt fast. I didn't know yet who had signed what or where the money went. I didn't know how deep the damage ran. But I knew this: the land that taught me to stand my ground deserved better than to be erased quietly. And so did I. The county clerk's office sat between a tax prep place and a diner that still advertised meatloaf on Wednesdays. I parked out front and took a minute before going in, palms resting on the steering wheel, breathing the way they teach you to breathe when your thoughts start stacking on top of each other. In Germany, everything had been scheduled down to the minute. Here, nothing was. Inside, the air smelled like paper and old coffee. A bell chimed softly when I opened the door. The woman behind the counter looked up over her glasses, the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen every version of family trouble pass through her hands. "How can I help you?" she asked. I gave my grandfather's name, the farm's address. I asked carefully for any filings related to the estate. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded and disappeared into the back. While I waited, my mind drifted back to the version of this place before it became an estate, before it was something to be divided and sold. My grandfather believed land was a responsibility, not an asset. He'd say it every time someone talked about money. "The land doesn't belong to you," he'd tell me. "You belong to it. You take care of it, and one day it'll take care of someone else." I was 9 the first time he let me drive the tractor, his hand steady over mine, the engine rumbling like a heartbeat. When I told him years later that I was joining the military, he didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "Serve clean. Come home clean." He never talked about wills or trusts out loud, but he talked about fairness, about doing things right, about not taking what wasn't yours just because you could. The clerk returned with a thin folder, too thin. "This is everything on file," she said. I flipped through it, standing at the counter. Probate filing. Executor listed as my father. A notice of inventory. A few dates circled in pen. "No trust documents?" I asked. She shook her head. "None recorded here." My stomach tightened. Grandpa had been meticulous. He kept receipts from the 80s. He labeled everything. There was no world where he left something this important to chance. "When was this filed?" I asked. She pointed to a date, 3 weeks before my grandfather died. "That's not possible," I said. She met my eyes, then something like sympathy flickering there. "It happens more than you think." I thanked her and walked back out into the sun, the folder tucked under my arm like it might run away if I loosened my grip. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from my father. I didn't listen to it. Instead, I drove back toward the farm, past fields that looked too open now, too exposed. The sign was still there. The house was quieter than before. Mark's truck was gone. Elaine's car remained. I found Elaine in the living room going through a box of papers at the dining table. She looked up, startled, then composed herself. "Did you calm down?" she asked. "I went to the county," I said. Her hands froze, just for a second. There's a probate filing, I continued. You didn't mention that. She closed the box. Dad handled it. There's no trust on record. She shrugged. Maybe Grandpa never finished it. I laughed once short and sharp. You didn't know him. She stiffened. You weren't here. There it was again. The phrase they used like a shield. I was stationed overseas, I said. I wasn't absent. She leaned back in her chair. You can't expect things to stop because you're gone. I didn't, I replied. I expected honesty. She stood. What are you accusing us of? Nothing, I said, yet. Her eyes narrowed. You always think you're better than us because you left. I thought of the nights I'd sat in a barracks room listening to planes take off, thinking about this place, thinking about home. Better wasn't the word. Further away was. I think you did this fast on purpose, I said, before I could ask questions. She laughed brittle. You're being paranoid. I walked past her and down the hall to my grandfather's bedroom. The dresser drawers were empty. The small safe he kept in the closet was gone. Where's the safe? I asked. Elaine appeared in the doorway. Dad took it. When? After the funeral. What was in it? She hesitated. Important stuff. Like what? She crossed her arms. Why does it matter? Because that safe held more than papers. It held intent. It held the truth of how my grandfather wanted things handled. And now it was gone. That night I slept in my old room, the one I'd kept even after moving out. The walls felt closer than I remembered. I lay awake listening to the house settle every creak, a reminder that this place was changing without my consent. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. You're asking the wrong questions. I stared at the screen, pulse quickening. Who is this? I typed back. No response. I sat up, heart pounding. Someone knew I was digging. Someone didn't want me to keep going. The next morning, I drove to the diner in town, the one Grandpa took me to after early mornings in the field. I ordered coffee and eggs and listened. In small towns, information doesn't hide well. It drifts. 2 booths over an older man mentioned seeing trucks late at night at my grandfather's place. Another said the auctioneer had been around weeks ago, not days. I finished my coffee and left a tip, the realization settling heavy in my chest. This hadn't been rushed because of grief. It had been rushed because of opportunity. When I pulled back into the driveway, my father was sitting on the porch alone, hands clasped, staring out at the fields. We need to talk, he said. I nodded. Yes, I replied, we do. But not yet. Not until I knew exactly what had been taken and why. Because land remembers, and so do I. The morning after I talked to my father on the porch, the farm felt hollowed out. Not empty in the way a place is empty when people are gone, but stripped like someone had come through with a list and a deadline. I walked the property slowly, the way my grandfather used to walk it at dawn, hands behind his back, boots leaving deliberate prints in the soil. He believed you could tell a lot by what the land looked like after people thought they were finished with it. The barn doors were locked. That alone was wrong. Grandpa never locked them. If someone needs shelter, he'd say they'll find it here. I tried the handle anyway. Solid. New lock. I circled the building, counting what was missing by the marks left behind. The outline where the hay baler used to sit. The clean rectangle on the wall where his tools hung in careful order. Someone had taken time here. Someone had planned. Inside the house, Elaine was packing another box. She didn't look up when I entered the dining room. I'm taking the photo albums, she said, as if reading my mind. You don't need those. I stopped short. Those are mine too. She sighed, annoyed. You have memories. I have responsibilities. That's not how inheritance works, I said. She taped the box shut with a sharp rip. Inheritance isn't a word anyone used until you showed up. I thought of the safe again. Of the way my grandfather used to tap the top of it before closing the closet like a habit he didn't realize he had. That safe held deeds, letters, insurance policies, and something else. I remembered him once late in the evening, telling me quietly that he'd made sure things were clear. Clear didn't look like this. My brother's voice came from the kitchen. You still here? I turned to see Mark leaning in the doorway, coffee in hand, wearing the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the hard part was already over. I live here, I said. He laughed. You live wherever the Air Force tells you. I didn't correct him, it wasn't the point. What did you take? I asked. He shrugged. Stuff. What stuff? The tractor. The truck, a few guns. Grandpa said I could have them. When did he say that? Mark's jaw tightened. Before. Before when... He looked away, before all this. I waited. Silence stretched. He broke it with a scoff. You're not going to win this by interrogating us. I'm not trying to win, I said. I'm trying to understand. He took a step closer. Then understand this, you weren't here. Elaine was, Dad was, we handled things. Handled, I repeated. Or helped yourselves. His eyes flashed, careful. Careful of what I asked. The truth. He set his coffee down hard. You always come in like you know better. I know what Grandpa valued, I said, and it wasn't speed. Mark shook his head and walked past me out the back door. I heard his truck start, then fade down the drive. By noon, the house was quieter than it had been since the funeral. Elaine left with another load. My father retreated to the den door closed. I sat at the kitchen table with the probate folder spread out in front of me, cross-referencing dates, with notes I'd started scribbling in the margins. That was when I noticed something small but wrong. The executor filing listed my father as acting on behalf of the estate. Standard. But the inventory date preceded the official death certificate by 2 days. That didn't happen by accident. Someone had moved early. Someone had known the timing. I called the number on the probate filing, a local attorney's office. The receptionist confirmed my father had come in with his daughter to file paperwork. Elaine. I thanked her and hung up the pieces aligning into a picture I didn't like. That afternoon I drove into town again. This time I went to the bank my grandfather had used for decades. The same branch manager still worked there, older now, glasses perched on his nose. He recognized me immediately. You're his granddaughter. Yes, sir. I'm sorry about your loss, he said, and he meant it. I have a question, I said. Did my grandfather ever set up a trust here? He frowned. I can't discuss details without... I understand, I said. But can you tell me if one exists? He hesitated, then nodded slowly. There were discussions. Were they finished? He leaned back, choosing his words. To my knowledge, yes. My pulse jumped. Then why isn't it on file with the county? His frown deepened. That's unusual. He didn't say more, but he didn't need to. I left the bank with confirmation of what my gut had been telling me since I saw the auction sign. Something had been buried. Something intentional. When I got back to the farm, my father was waiting for me at the table. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago. We should talk now, he said. I sat across from him. Okay. He folded his hands. Your grandfather didn't want this to be complicated. And yet I said quietly it is. He exhaled. Elaine pushed to move quickly. She said the bills were stacking up, that taxes were coming due. Were they, I asked? He hesitated, some. Enough to sell everything in secret. His shoulders sagged. I thought I was doing the right thing. By who? By all of us. I leaned forward. You filed probate before he passed. His eyes widened. That's not... It's on record, I said. You let them take things that weren't theirs. He closed his eyes. I didn't know how to stop it. The truth in that was worse than a lie. That evening I sat alone on the back steps, watching the sun drop behind the trees. I held one of the few things left, a worn notebook my grandfather kept in his coat pocket. I'd found it tucked behind a shelf, missed in the rush. Inside were notes about planting cycles, weather patterns, and on the last page, a line written in careful ink. Make sure it's done right. I didn't know yet how big this was going to get. I didn't know how far it would go. But I knew I couldn't let it end here. Because what was left wasn't just furniture and tools. It was the truth. And I was done letting it be packed away and driven off in the night. The law office sat above a hardware store that still sold nails by the pound. The stairs creaked as I climbed them, each step loud in the quiet afternoon. I hadn't slept much the night before. I'd stayed up rereading the probate file, my grandfather's notebook open beside it. The words "make sure it's done right" circling my thoughts like a command. The attorney's name was on a small brass plaque by the door. Inside the office smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. Framed certificates lined the walls, interspersed with black and white photos of the town from decades ago. Grain silos, a Main Street parade, a courthouse ribbon cutting. This was a place that remembered things. The attorney himself was in his late 50s, hair silver at the temples, tie loosened. He listened without interrupting as I laid everything out: the auction sign, the private sale, the missing safe, the early probate filing, the bank manager's hesitation. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "Your grandfather was careful," he said. "I remember him." "You helped him set things up," I said. "It wasn't a question." He nodded. "A family trust, finalized last year." My breath caught. "Then why isn't it recorded?" "It was," he said. "Then it was withdrawn." "By who?" He looked at me steadily. "By your father, acting under a power of attorney." The room felt smaller. He didn't have the authority to do that. No, the attorney agreed, he didn't. He opened a drawer and pulled out copies. Pages slid across the desk toward me, heavy with significance. The trust named all 3 grandchildren as beneficiaries. It spelled out the conditions for any sale notice consent oversight, none of which had happened. This, he said, tapping the page, is why things moved quickly. Someone wanted assets out of the trust before questions could be asked. "Elaine," I said. He didn't confirm it, he didn't need to. "What happens now?" I asked. "That depends on how far you want to take it." I thought of the auction sign rattling in the wind, of Mark driving away with the tractor, of my father sitting at the table saying he didn't know how to stop it. "I want it corrected," I said, "by the book." He nodded once. "Then we start by freezing what's left and tracing what's gone." The next 48 hours moved faster than the weeks before it. Notices went out. Banks were contacted. Buyers were informed that title could be challenged. Some reacted with anger. Others with relief. They hadn't liked how rushed the sale felt either. One woman called me in tears. She'd bought my grandmother's dining set not knowing its history. If it needs to come back, she said, I understand. Her kindness sat heavy in my chest. That evening, my father knocked on my door. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders rounded, hands empty. "I talked to the lawyer," he said. I nodded. "I know." He swallowed. "Elaine said it was fine. She said the trust was just paperwork." "Paper is what keeps people honest," I replied. He flinched. I was trying to keep the peace. "At whose expense?" He didn't answer. Outside headlights swept across the yard. Mark's truck pulled in. Elaine followed in her car. They came into the house together, their confidence gone, replaced by tight smiles and clipped movements. "We need to talk," Elaine said. "We already are," I replied. She sat crossing her legs, eyes sharp. "You're blowing this up." "I'm correcting it." "You could ruin Dad." He signed documents he didn't have the right to sign. She leaned forward. "You weren't here. You don't understand the pressure." "I understand authority," I said, "and I understand abuse of it." Mark slammed his hand on the table. "You're doing this out of spite." I looked at him. "I'm doing this because Grandpa trusted us not to tear his life apart." Silence followed, the kind that presses in on you. Elaine stood abruptly. "You think some papers make you right?" "No," I said quietly. "They make the truth visible." My phone buzzed. A message from the attorney, injunction filed, transfers paused. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not satisfaction, not victory, just steadiness. "From this point on," I said, "everything goes through counsel. No more side deals, no more midnight trucks." My father sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. Elaine stared at me like I'd betrayed her. Mark looked away. I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The fields were darkening, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Somewhere a fence wire hummed softly in the breeze. Paper doesn't forget. It doesn't care who's loud or who's fast. It waits. And when you finally look at it closely, it tells you exactly where things went wrong. I stood there a long time, listening to the land breathe, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. By the end of the week, the farm no longer felt like a private family problem. It felt like a story the town was beginning to recognize. That's how these places work. You don't need headlines. You need conversations. A pause when someone sees you at the post office. A longer look than usual at the grocery store. People didn't ask questions outright, not at first. They just watched, measuring which version of the truth would hold. The first knock came from across the fence line. Mr. Halverson, who'd farmed the neighboring acreage since before I was born, stood there with his hat in his hands. "I heard things got tangled," he said carefully. "That's one way to put it." He nodded. "Your granddad wouldn't have wanted it done like this?" I waited. He shifted his weight, then added, "I saw trucks, late nights, week before he passed. Didn't sit right with me. Did you see who was driving? I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. Didn't want to assume. But I remember Elaine's car. That night I wrote everything down. Names, dates, times. I'd learned overseas that memory gets slippery under pressure. Paper didn't. The next call came from the auction company, a different voice this time, male, formal, strained. We've been advised to cooperate, he said. We were told the executor had full authority. Who told you that? I asked. A family member. Which one? Another pause. Ms. Elaine. The pattern was clear now, not a misunderstanding, a design. Word spread faster after that. A woman from church stopped by with a casserole and a story about how she'd been approached to buy one of Grandpa's rifles privately, cash only. A mechanic admitted he'd serviced Mark's truck after it hauled equipment off-site equipment that wasn't listed anywhere official. Each conversation tightened the net. Not everyone was sympathetic. Some people avoided me, others whispered that I was stirring trouble, that I should let it go for the sake of family. I heard it in the diner, felt it in the way conversations dropped when I walked past. I thought about that a lot, about the idea that peace is more important than truth, about how often women are asked to smooth things over, to absorb damage quietly, so everyone else can move on. That night my father sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one his father had built by hand. They're talking, he said. I know. You don't have to do this. Yes, I replied, I do. He rubbed his hands together. Elaine says you're trying to punish her. I'm trying to stop her. For what? His voice cracked. For trying to keep things together. For deciding she gets to choose who matters. He looked down. She said you'd never come back anyway. The words landed harder than I expected. I came back, I said, and that should have been enough. He didn't respond. 2 days later, the injunction went public. Notices posted, transfers flagged, buyers contacted. Some were angry. One man threatened to sue everyone involved. Another apologized over and over, embarrassed to have been part of something that smelled wrong. I met with the attorney again, this time with a deputy from the county present. Statements were taken, documents copied. Elaine was formally notified that her communications would be reviewed. She showed up that evening furious. You went to the sheriff, she demanded. I went to the law, I said. She laughed sharply. You're really going to burn the whole thing down? No, I replied. You already did. I'm just turning on the lights. Mark stood behind her, jaw, tight eyes darting. He didn't look like a man confident in his choices. He looked like someone waiting for the ground to give way. You didn't have to involve outsiders, he said. You involved them when you sold what wasn't yours. Elaine stepped closer. Dad signed. Dad trusted you. She flinched just slightly. The deputy cleared his throat. From here on, communication goes through counsel, he said. Any attempt to move assets could result in charges. That word charges hung in the air. After they left, the house felt too quiet. My father sat heavily, staring at nothing. I failed him, he said, and I failed you. I didn't rush to comfort him. Some moments need to sit. Outside, the land was settling into evening. Crickets, a distant truck, the low hum of the highway, life going on. I walked the fence line again, the posts solid under my hand. This place had survived droughts, floods, bad years. It had outlasted people who thought they could bend it to their will. Inside, my phone buzzed with a message from the attorney. Funds traced, accounts identified, next steps pending. I sat on the porch steps, the weight of it all pressing down, not just the betrayal, but the responsibility. Doing the right thing doesn't make you popular, it just makes you necessary. As the sun dipped low, I thought about my grandfather's hands, rough and steady, and the way he believed in accountability without cruelty. I was beginning to understand that lesson more deeply now. This wasn't about reclaiming objects. It was about restoring order, about saying that what's built over a lifetime can't be dismantled quietly because it's inconvenient. The town was watching, the law was moving, and for the first time since I came home, I felt like the ground beneath my feet was firm again. The meeting happened on a Monday morning, the kind of gray, undecided day that feels appropriate for things you don't want to face, but know you have to. We gathered not at the farm, but in the attorney's office, the neutral ground where no one could claim emotional territory. My father arrived first, shoulders hunched inside a jacket that used to fit him better. Mark came next, late eyes shadowed. Elaine was last heels, clicking sharply against the floor like she wanted everyone to know she wasn't afraid. She was wrong about that. We sat around a long wooden table scarred with old marks, the kind left by decades of people pressing down too hard with their pens. The attorney laid out folders in front of each of us. A deputy from the county stood near the door, quiet, but unmistakably present. "This is not a criminal proceeding." The attorney began calm and precise. "Not yet. This is a review of fiduciary conduct." Elaine crossed her arms. "You're making this sound dramatic." He didn't look at her. "I'm making it sound accurate." He started with the trust documents, sliding copies across the table. He pointed out the clauses beneficiaries required notices limitations on authority. He explained slowly how withdrawing the trust without consent, then liquidating assets privately constituted a breach. Mark shifted in his chair. "We needed the money." "For what the attorney asked." Silence. "For Dad," Elaine said finally, "for expenses." The attorney nodded once. "We traced the funds." Elaine's jaw tightened. My father's hands began to shake. "Some of the proceeds went to outstanding bills," the attorney continued. "Some went to accounts held by Mr. Mark and Ms. Elaine." Mark stood abruptly. "That's not fair." The deputy's presence suddenly mattered. "Sit down," the attorney said evenly. "Mark did." My father stared at the table, eyes wet. "I didn't know it went that far." "You signed the authority," the attorney said gently. "That made you responsible." My father looked at me, then really looked at me like he was seeing the cost of his choices written on my face. "I thought I was helping," he said. "You were choosing," I replied. "There's a difference." Elaine leaned forward. "You don't understand what it was like here. You left. Everything fell on us." "I didn't leave the family," I said. "I served, and I came back." Her voice rose. "You think that makes you better?" "No," I said quietly. "I think it makes me careful." The attorney outlined the consequences: civil penalties, restitution, the possibility of further investigation if cooperation stopped. He spoke in plain language, the kind meant to leave no room for misunderstanding. Elaine's confidence cracked. "What do you want?" she demanded, looking at me. I took a breath. "I want the trust reinstated. I want full accounting. I want the land protected from any further sale without unanimous consent." "And us?" Mark asked. "I want you to answer for what you took." My father covered his face. "I never wanted it to come to this." "Neither did Grandpa," I said. The meeting ended without shouting. That surprised me. The damage was too real now for theatrics. People signed where they were told to sign. Elaine's pen hovered more than once before touching paper. Mark avoided my eyes entirely. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. My father walked with me to my car. He looked older than he had a week ago, like the truth had accelerated time. "I failed you," he said again. "I know," I replied. "What matters now is what you do next." He nodded slowly. "I'll cooperate." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was accountability. And sometimes that's the first real step. That night back at the farm, I walked the perimeter alone. The fields were quiet, resting. I thought about how often the word family gets used to excuse harm, how people wrap it around bad decisions like insulation, hoping it will keep consequences out. But family, real family, doesn't take without asking. It doesn't rush in the dark. It doesn't tell one child they're expendable because they're strong. I stopped at the oak tree where my grandmother was buried. The leaves whispered overhead. "I'm trying," I said aloud, not sure who I was speaking to. The phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from the attorney: restitution process initiated. Assets flagged. Trust reinstatement pending court approval. Progress, not victory, progress. I sat on the ground back against the tree, feeling the earth steady beneath me. This was the cost of calling it family, facing the truth when pretending would be easier. Holding the line when letting go would hurt less in the moment, but more in the end. The land didn't ask me to be gentle. It asked me to be honest. And for the first time since I came home, I believed I was doing right by it. The court order came through on a Thursday afternoon, stamped and final in the way only official things ever are. The trust was reinstated. Sales executed outside its authority were voided or reversed where possible. Funds that had moved where they shouldn't have were ordered returned. It wasn't clean. It wasn't quick, but it was clear, and clarity after weeks of fog felt like breathing again. I drove back to the farm alone that evening. The sun was low, the fields lit from the side, every row casting a long, honest shadow. I parked at the end of the drive and sat there a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the wind move through what was left of the corn. No trucks this time, no whispers. Just land doing what it had always done, waiting. Inside the house, the rooms felt different. Not fuller, quieter. The absence was still there, but it no longer felt like theft. It felt like a pause. A place between what had been taken and what might be rebuilt. On the kitchen table sat a single envelope from the attorney, the last of the paperwork for now. I set it aside and walked through the rooms, slowly touching door frames, tracing the edge of the counter where my grandfather used to lean while he drank his coffee. Some things were gone for good. The tractor would come back after its buyer was reimbursed, but a few tools had vanished into pawn shops and private sales that couldn't be untangled. I accepted that. Loss doesn't always reverse just because the truth shows up. What mattered was that the taking had stopped. My father came by the next morning. He stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I stepped aside to let him in. We sat at the table where we'd argued, where his father had taught him to fix watches and measure wood twice. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes on his hands, "about how I let things slide, about how I told myself it was love. Love without boundaries," I said, gently turns into permission. He nodded. "I'm learning that too late." "Not too late," I replied, "just late." We talked for a long time, not about blame, there was plenty of that to go around, but about responsibility. He agreed to step back from any role in managing the estate. He said he'd testify honestly if needed. He asked quietly if I could ever forgive him. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm willing to keep talking." That seemed to be enough for now. Mark didn't come by. Elaine sent a message through her attorney. Short, defensive. I read it once and put it down. Healing doesn't mean reopening doors that were slammed shut on purpose. Sometimes it means building better ones and choosing who gets a key. In the weeks that followed, neighbors stopped by. Some returned items they'd bought, embarrassed, apologetic. Others brought stories about my grandfather, about the land, about how they'd worried something wasn't right, but didn't know how to say it. I listened. I thanked them. I learned how wide a circle this place had drawn around itself without me ever realizing it. One afternoon, a young couple drove up. They'd bought a small piece of equipment at the private sale and wanted to make it right. We talked. We laughed awkwardly. We figured out a fair solution. They left relieved. I stood in the yard afterward, feeling the weight lift a little more. I kept one thing from the house that day, a small wooden box I'd found tucked behind a shelf overlooked in the rush. Inside were letters my grandfather had written to my grandmother when he was young. Simple notes, weather, work, love. On the last page of one, he'd written, "What lasts is what we take care of." That night I sat on the porch steps and read those letters while the stars came out. I thought about service and sacrifice and the quiet ways people show who they are. I thought about how easy it is to confuse speed with necessity, convenience with care. And I thought about how strength, real strength, often looks like standing still when everyone else wants you to move on. The farm won't look the same again. That's the truth. But it doesn't have to be erased to be honored. It can change honestly. It can be protected with rules that reflect the values it was built on. It can endure. I don't know how my family will look a year from now. Some wounds heal slowly. Some relationships don't return to what they were. What I do know is this: I didn't come home to save a place. I came home to save a promise. The promise that what's earned won't be taken in the dark. That the strong won't be treated as expendable. That love doesn't require silence. If you're listening to this and it sounds familiar, if you've stood in a house that no longer felt like yours, or been told to accept what's left because you were gone, know this: asking questions isn't betrayal. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty. And choosing truth over comfort doesn't make you the villain. It makes you responsible. If this story made you think of someone you love or something you're still carrying, I'd like to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. We have many more stories like this, stories about family integrity and finding your footing again. So consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.